Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? It's good to see you. Hi, Lorena. Xiaoyun is checking in on Remind, saying hello. It's good to see you. We have 2 chapters this week. Time is limited. Yes, Xiaoyun does bring up an interesting point on Remind. This week we are covering 2 chapters, chapter 9 and 10. There are 22 chapters in this textbook in only 16 weeks, so there are going to be a few weeks when we cover more than one chapter's worth of material. But I'm going to try to cut down the chapter's content for you to make it a little bit more digestible. Really, at the end of this semester, all I want you to understand is a narrative, a story about human development, so that it'll help you understand and relate to other people of different ages more effectively. Maybe help you bring up children a little more effectively, and also live a happier, longer life. So we're just going to finish what we can finish, Xiaoyun, and leave the rest out. We have Ebony checking in. It's good to see you. Hi, folks. Also, we have Stephanie. Everybody say hello to Stephanie. She usually works on the weekdays, and so I don't think she's allowed to get here live as often as she would like. So everybody give her a high five online, if you will. Looks like we've got 8 people here today. Not a bad audience for a Tuesday. Let's talk briefly about the exam before we get into the lecture. I'm going to go ahead and go to the whiteboard if you don't mind. All right, so we have 27 students. 6 of you made A's, 10 of you made B's, 8 had C's, and 6 scored lower than a C. But all in all, a very good class performance. There was 100% test participation. You'd be surprised how many people didn't take my Psych 150 midterm this weekend. So thank you very much for being on the ball when it comes to taking the test. Over the course of this semester, 27 students times 8 homework assignments, that's like 216 or something attempts. I've received homework 98.7% of the time. Thank you very much for your awesome homework participation. My Psych 150 class is not doing nearly that well. And also, if you look at your collaboration grades, this doesn't even count extra credit, but you're participating in collaborations at a 98% rate. So basically what this tells me is that you are a very engaged class and you are going to do well in here. Remember, I will remember your level of engagement at grade time. So if I need to help you out a little bit, I will more than likely be willing to do that. All right. Now, quick date that is important for everybody, October the 26th. It is the last day to drop with a W. Now, you probably don't need that for this class, but after that date, if a teacher drops you for failure to attend after October 26th, you will get a grade of WF, which will look absolutely terrible on your transcript, and you can't retake the class and replace that F either. It is a permanent F on your transcript. So if you have a class that you are maybe teetering on the attendance brink of being withdrawn from, and you think you may miss a class after October 26th, I suggest you drop before October 26th. Okay, now a bunch of W's on your transcript doesn't look good either, even though a W doesn't count towards GPA. The admissions counselor at your next school will look at your grades, and if they see a ton of W's, that's not going to tell them good stuff about you either. But you'd rather have a W than a WF. So if this is one of those rare situations, make sure you do that before October 26th. Any questions so far? I just wanted to tell you that you're doing an absolutely great job when it comes to your work in this class. I'm really impressed with everybody. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the Chapter 9 lecture. So, Chapter 9 is related to physical and cognitive growth in middle and late childhood. So we're going to talk about the pattern of physical growth, neurological development, and motor ability changes during this age. We're going to talk about the diseases and illnesses during this age. Remember, developmental psychology is useful because it's helping us live happier, healthier lives. That occurs because we know more about what's dangerous to children. We're going to talk a little bit about IQ testing. We're going to talk about the gifted child, a little bit about Piaget, and we're going to talk about the information processing approach. Remember, we talked about long-term and short-term memory and attention processes. So that's what I hope to cover today as quickly as possible. Looks like the audience is swelled up to 11 students. Fantastic. That's almost half of you in live lecture. That's that kind of engagement I'm talking about. Thank you very much for being great students. Okay? All right, so just to reorient you, if you'll remember, we're talking about middle and late childhood. That's that time from when you are school age to pretty much it's the prepubertal years. And there's a little star right there because some of you are going to enter puberty at 10 or 11, but we're talking about that time from 6 to around 11. So school age to right when puberty strikes you. Okay, remember, growth is going to average 2 to 3 inches per year and 5 to 7 pounds per year. So you're not going to grow as tall quite as fast, and you're not going to gain quite as much weight. Now, we're still growing pretty quickly, but it's not the 2 to 5 inches in early childhood, and it's not the upper limit of 10 pounds per year in early childhood. So you're slowing down just a little bit. Now, your bones are still continuing to ossify during middle and late childhood. However, they will yield to pressure and pull more than mature bones. Why is this important, Chris? Well, because a lot of you, when you have children, you're going to have the opportunity to send them into travel sports. If your kid's good at soccer, baseball, or football, suddenly they're going to be asked to be on a select team. And what's going to happen is your child is going to be engaging in a physical activity an awful lot. And that's going to put stress on different parts of the body and bones and ligaments that haven't quite matured yet. So one of the things that I see a ton of in youth baseball is pitchers with arm and with elbow and shoulder injuries simply because they overuse this soft bone during middle and late childhood. So one of the things you need to be aware of when you put your kids into athletics, it is great for your kid to be athletic. I hope they're athletic because too many kids are overweight. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that you put your kid in every sport. Put them in basketball, soccer, football, baseball. Put them in sports year round, but make sure it's a different sport using different muscles and bones every year. And that's how you're going to make your kid a really good athlete. So if you want your kid to be the greatest basketball player, that's fine, but you should put them in other sports because all of these other sports condition kids to be athletic without necessarily putting stress on any particular bone part. Okay, girls are slightly bigger during this period because they some of them go through puberty earlier, so the girls are going to be a little bit taller and bigger than the boys. All right, now during middle and late childhood, your child's going to go from being kind of a clumsy little athlete at age 6 to being pretty stinking smooth at 12 years old. I see this in baseball. The little 6-year-old kids can't quite swing the bat. They don't have very good hand-eye coordination. They can't catch a ball. They can't throw it very accurately at 6. By the time they're 12, you can see some kids who are playing baseball as smoothly as an adult. So this fine motor skills and gross motor skills are really going to improve during middle and late childhood. Girls are going to outperform the boys in their use of fine motor skills, and all this is related to myelination of the central nervous system. Now, I do want to point to the prefrontal cortex. There are going to be significant changes to the brain during middle and late childhood. The brain, however, is not going to grow. It's just going to reorganize and continue to myelinate. The majority of this change is going to be in the frontal lobes. For the first time, you're in 5 years, 6 years old, your children are ready to sit down and focus, but they're not going to be great at sitting down and focus. That ability is going to develop throughout middle and late childhood. Cortical thickness is going to increase in the temporal and frontal lobes, leading to maturity and impulse control, as well as improved long-term memory. All right. And what you're going to see is sort of this differential activation. So your brain's going to start to activate certain parts of the brain very often and other parts of the brain not nearly as often as it creates its final neuroarchitecture. Okay, and so the brain pathways and circuitry involved in the prefrontal cortex, which is the last part of your brain to develop, are still continuing to develop during this age. I would agree it is very important to keep kids active, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Middle and late childhood is a time of excellent health. If you remember that graph, that survival curve I showed you last week, kids are not likely at all to die during this age, and they're definitely the chronic illnesses haven't kicked in, and so this is a time of excellent health for children. The top 5 causes of death for children are accidents, cancers, birth defects, homicide, and heart disease. What I want to point out to you is that the number 1 killer of kids is accidents at this age. Please, 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 belt your kids in the seat very effectively. Make sure your kids wear their seatbelt and put them in the back seat. That's really what the big danger is during this period, okay? Now, the second biggest cause of death is cancer, specifically leukemia during this age. I remember as a 14-year-old living in Cary, we had a set of twins that lived in our neighborhood, and one of the boys had leukemia, and he died. He made it through middle childhood, but he died as an early teen, and it sure was leukemia. Now, with advancements in medicine, kids are living longer because of these advancements, and a cure rate is not dying for 5 years. So what they're saying is that 80% of the kids are living for at least 5 years with this particular disease. Cardiovascular disease is not very common during this age. Kids aren't going to have heart attacks during this age. However, if your kid's diet is poor and their level of exercise is low enough, you're going to start seeing the risk factors for adult coronary disease, elevated blood pressure, high body fat levels. So it is important to get your kids exercising. Okay, as Jane Doe mentions, your kids should be on a wheel. 17% of children aged 6 to 11 are considered obese. And you know what? I see this on the ball field every weekend. I saw this ball team the other day. They're a local ball team, and they all hit the ball really far. But all of those kids had pot bellies, and I thought it was really sad to see a team full of pot-bellied baseball players at 11 years of age. Far too many kids are eating poor diets and not exercising enough. See, in my age, you used to have to go outside all day on Saturday. Your mom or dad would kick you out of the house, and you weren't allowed back in till dinner time. Go out and play. We didn't have video games. The TVs only had 3 channels. It was easy to stay thin there because our parents didn't have the money to take us out to fast food. That was considered a treat, not a daily thing. And so we didn't have the opportunity to get heavy. So I'm not bearing down on this generation because you're any less self-controlled than we were back then. You just have the opportunities not to be healthy now that we did not have back then. So it's very important to make sure that your kid is active. So yes, heredity does play a part, but the environmental context does matter. Please, please, please get in the habit of learning how to cook. home-cooked foods and including vegetables in there. There's nothing better for family cohesiveness than a dinner together. And there's nothing better for your kids' health than to see broccoli and vegetables on the dinner table. I'm kind of a 4-food group Nazi at my house. There must be a green vegetable on the table every night. My wife actually freaks out because she wasn't brought up this way. Her mom fried everything, but not in Chris Roddenberry's household. We eat chicken 5 times a week and we eat lots of vegetables. And so these sort of environmental things will help your children maintain a proper weight. If you live a healthier lifestyle, your children will live a healthier lifestyle. And you know what? Make sure your kids are out there running. Too many parents are doing play dates, organized play, and their kids, as a result, aren't active. I know it's tough, but if you can push them outside with their Game Boys and telephones, higher levels of physical activity are linked to lower levels of these metabolic disease risks. So you don't want your kid to have the high cholesterol, the big waist circumference, and the high insulin levels. While they don't have heart disease now, these are the things that are going to lead to heart disease later. Okay, so if your kid's running around and playing 4 different sports, there's going to be a lower incidence of obesity. You know what? And running outside and focusing actually helps you focus your mind when you get in the classroom. The kids' attention and memory and ability to inhibit their impulses and focus is going to be improved with lots of aerobic exercise. And your kids are just going to be more focused and creative in the classroom. Now, how do we get children to exercise? Well, hopefully your school's providing good activity programs at school facilities. I hope your kids have an outdoor recess in middle, and late childhood. In elementary school, they should have recess. I hope your school does too. It's kind of fun to put your kids on teams. And you know what you can do as a parent? Go outside yourself. Don't send your kids outside. Just like you want to model their eating behavior, you need to model their active behavior. You'd be surprised. Kids wouldn't mind going on a hike. Take them out to see some things. Make sure you're doing activities where there's walking involved. But you, the parent, have to model that behavior if you want your kid to follow that behavior. Let's talk briefly about Piaget. I don't want to belabor Piaget too much because we've talked about him a lot and we don't have a lot of time. But Piaget said that during this period, we were in the 3rd stage of cognitive development. Remember, the first stage of development for 0 to 2 years, you are pre-symbolic. From 2 to 7, he argued you're symbolic, but not that logical. And in the 3rd stage, from 7 to 11, he found that kids tended to have pretty good logical abilities, but they weren't good at abstract thinking. Okay, so this is his characterization of the 3rd stage of development, the concrete operational stage. Your child is logical, but not real good at abstract thinking. And the ways in which he tested them, I'm not going to belabor these too much, but he had logic tasks that he would engage the kids in. And I'm just telling you for historical context. He had classification tasks, seriation tests, and transitivity tests. So if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, is A bigger than C? You should be able to know that. If A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, you should be able to logically deduce that A is bigger than C. Thank you. You just did a transitivity task. All right. In a seriation task, he might have you arrange things from shortest to longest, smallest to largest, and shortest to longest, heaviest to lightest. That's a seriation task. Now, your younger children can do that, but they make mistakes. What he discovered with kids at this age is they could actually look at the entire set of things and pick the longest one out and then pick the next longest one out. So they're not only the ability to compare things, but to do it in a logical manner. And then what you see below you, right here below you, is a classification task where you can see who's aunts and uncles, sisters and brothers in a family. And what he found was that children during this age had no problem engaging in classification, seriation, or transitivity tasks, but they had difficult thinking about things that were abstract. So that's what he characterized this age group as. He mentioned that a horizontal decollage. It turns out that kids started being able to do this sometime around the age of 5 or 6 or 7, but it's not like they could do all 3 tasks at the same time. Peter might be able to do classification before he did seriation and transitivity. Tina might be able to do seriation before she did classification and transitivity. And so he argued that they sort of happened in this, what he called horizontal décalage. Okay? Now, that's the old school cognitive point of view. Let's talk a little bit about the information processing. All right, during middle and late childhood, most children dramatically improve their ability to sustain and control attention. Remember I told you the 2 and 4-year-old, when they do the comparison tasks, trying to figure out how 2 pictures are similar or different, they don't do it very systematically. As you get older, the children's ability to do a side-by-side comparison systematically based on the eye tracking greatly improves. Also, the child's ability to maintain that focus for extended period of times increases greatly. So what you're going to see is that children's attention abilities go from not very good at 5 years of age to very good by the age of 11 and 12. Not quite adult-like, but they are able to maintain executive control, that is, know how to systematically use their attention, and they're able to maintain it for longer periods of time. And during this age, children know what to pay attention to. Your 5-year-old, you have to tell them what to pay attention to, because they can't tell. If you're telling them a story, you're trying to remind a 5-year-old of some vocabulary words, they may be paying attention to the story that you're telling them rather than the words you want them to remember. So children at 11 and 12, they know what to pay attention to. You folks take it for granted, but there was a time when you were hearing things and being taught, and you didn't know what was important and what was not important. So all of these executive kinds of tasks improve greatly from 5 to 11. All right, so that's sort of your short-term executive memory. Now, your long-term memory does increase with age during middle and late childhood. As I suggested to you, the frontal lobe is responsible for your attentional abilities. Remember, I suggested, I suggested back here that the brain changes were most extensive in your frontal and temporal lobes. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this earlier. But your attention processes are primarily directed by your frontal lobe processes. So you see how they improve greatly during this age. And then your temporal lobe is where your long-term memories are stored. And you'll notice that your long-term memory begins to increase during this age, during middle and late childhood, as the temporal lobes begin to mature. And this is going to be due in some part to an improvement in your metacognitive abilities. And metacognitive means knowing how to remember stuff, right? So a 4-year-old doesn't realize that you have to think about something multiple times to remember it. A 4-year-old doesn't know that you have to put effort into trying to remember something. They don't understand that about memory. As a 10 or 11-year-old, you understand that in order to try and remember something, you need to have to think about it a few times. One of the strategies that I think students need to learn, even at your age, is a metacognitive strategy. There are different tricks you can use for more quickly memorizing things, like mnemonics and the method of location. So metacognitive abilities are those strategies that allow you to remember stuff. So your temporal lobes are going to improve, and you are going to be more smart about how you try to remember things. Does that does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to you. And you know what? At this age, children begin to develop and can use areas of expertise. Okay, what does that mean? That means that not only do kids have things in their memory, but they can use these to improve their abilities. If you look at this graph right underneath me, they show this expertise effect. So they compared children in middle childhood with college students on two different memory tasks. The first task was for random numbers, and as you'll see, the college students with better meta memory probably were able to remember more words, more numbers than the children were. However, if you compared these college students without chess experience to children with chess experience for their memory of the pieces on a chessboard, what they found is that the kids with chess experience were much better at remembering where the pieces on the chessboard, where the pieces were on the chessboard, than college students without chess experience. So, in one graph, you see the college students just larger memory allows them to remember more words. However, if you make the comparison about some area of expertise that the kids have relative to the adults, they can demonstrate use of that area of expertise. Does that make sense? So if your kid is interested in biology and you teach them lots of animals, or you teach them about the human body during their 7, 8, 9-year-old age, they can use that knowledge that you're giving them. They can actually demonstrate that intellectual ability. So if you think about it, your 3 and 4-year-old's not really demonstrating bodies of knowledge, but your 11 and 12-year-old will finally have bodies of knowledge. Maybe they're really good at cartoons. Maybe they're really good at musical bands. Maybe they're really good at Yu-Gi-Oh! Or other card games. Your kid will have areas of expertise that they can now leverage. Okay? Any questions? Now, we're going to talk briefly about disabilities in school. Oh, no. Credola, hold on just a second. I can't do anything about it. You know what? I'm just going to go with it. I'm sorry, my image is a little bit in the way. I forgot to pre-test it before this lecture. All right, now, here's the thing. 12.9% of kids school age in the United States receive special education-related services, an increase of 3% from 1980. And this is probably because we're doing a better job of diagnosing and identifying school-related disabilities. This includes students with difficulties, as well as students with extra capabilities. I don't know if you knew this, but every year there are 56 million students in the American education system, and almost 13% of them have special needs. Now, some of these special needs are kids with disabilities, but some of these kids are kids with special abilities and gifts. And what we use is we use school psychologists as the first line to help us identify these parts of the population. Now, why does this matter? Well, here's the thing. Even though we're educating 56 million kids, we want to try to make sure that we meet each kid in their zone of proximal development. You remember that word from Vygotsky? Your really super gifted kids, they need a challenge too. So we need to meet them where their area is. But you know what? Kids with disabilities doesn't mean they shouldn't be in school. Some kids have very specific disabilities that don't really relate to their intellect per se, but represent specific disabilities. And we need to give these kids a normal schooling, if possible, with special accommodations and special help for the difficulties that they have, kind of like ADHD that Lorena Massey represents. And what I want you to know is that learning disabilities represent the largest part of this group. And this is a specific difficulty in learning or understanding or using spoken or written language or math that is not related to your general intellect. So it's a difficulty with some aspect of school that is not related to your overall level of IQ. All right. Now, this is not the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities. This is just a difficulty either doing the math or the language. Now, there are visual disabilities, there are motor disabilities. If you have trouble with fine motor control, you're not going to be able to write in school, and that's going to make it difficult for you. But a learning disability is kind of like dyslexia or math disorder. Okay, that's sort of a learning disability. So, Okay, so if you look here, we have different kinds of disabilities in school. So you've got learning disabilities, there's speech and hearing impairments. If your kid has trouble talking or hearing, that's going to affect their school performance. Some kids have autism. We put kids that are on the spectrum in school because they can profit from education. And then we have some kids with intellectual disabilities. Low IQ scores is what that means. And then we have some kids with emotional disturbances in school. And the idea is, according to United States law, all of these children have to receive the best education possible. We can't write any of these students off. Okay, now boys are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities. And you'll see we've got 3 types of learning disabilities: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. And these are all learning disabilities. Boys are more likely to have these learning disabilities. Okay, ADD, another disorder, learning disorder. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Lorena mentions that she has that. There are actually 3 different kinds. Lorena is, would you say your ADD is because you're hyperactive, because you're impulsive and can't sit down, or because you just have trouble focusing your attention? So clinical psychologists typically diagnose these ADHD as having one of these 3 main features. Again, boys are twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADD, 3 times as likely to have a learning disorder, twice as likely to have ADHD. Your book talks about the possible causes for ADHD. It seems to be a fairly common diagnosis. And there are lots of causes. Is it because of genetics? There is a behavioral genetic study do show a genetic component to this disorder. There's a question as to whether or not brain damage during prenatal exposure, so mom smoking or cigarette or alcohol exposure, it's been shown to be correlated with later attention disorder effects. And if you think about it, these teratogenic factors may impact the development of these frontal lobe, which would lead to the ADD, and high maternal stress, which may lead to a low premature birth and a low birth weight, is also associated with attention deficit disorders. So students with a learning disability and students with ADHD are all considered a learning disability. Let me go back again. I don't know if I made this clear. So your learning disability is your catch-all category that's going to deal with your dyslexia, your math disorder, your dysgraphia, your handwriting disorder, and your ADHD. So those are going to represent the largest category of school-related disorders. And your school psychologists are going to be the one that diagnose those disorders. Now, here's the thing. Your book talks about sort of the challenges for kids with ADHD. They are at risk for lower academic achievement. The inability to control their impulse is going to make it difficult for peer relationships. They're more likely to drop out of school or engage in risky behaviors that have them winding up as adolescent parents or substance users. And this difficulty in school and peer relationships is going to manifest itself in higher rates of depression and anxiety and just general non-compliant, non-conformant kind of behavior. which is going to lead to just general difficulties in teenage life. ADHD has been associated with lower scores in college math and reading tests, increased criminal activity, and unemployment. So, yeah, and Lorena says that she depends on a pill. And they do have Ritalin and other drugs that they use, which bizarrely enough are stimulants. They stimulate the part of your brain that is not functioning at the right level. So they stimulate your frontal lobe, so your frontal lobe calms you down. Okay? And you're going to see another thing that you're going to see. Let's see, we talked about ADHD. So emotional and behavioral problems. You're going to find children who are going to start being too aggressive. Depression's going to rear its head during this age. You're going to start to see your bullies. Depression and anxiety is going to begin to manifest itself. Remember, we talked about the inhibited personality and how it is related with anxiety-related disorders. When you go to school, you push the kid into the social position, and all those fears associated with poor self-image will begin to manifest themselves. The depression, the anxiety, your under-controlled and impulsive child may become more aggressive, and all of these may manifest themselves in children who don't fit in well at school. So not only is school about learning, but school is also about fitting in well. And what you're going to see is some of these under-controlled and inhibited personalities are going to begin to have difficulty in elementary school. Your book says that boys are 3 times as likely to have some of these emotional problems. So your little boys are just going to have more trouble in elementary school than girls. They're going to be more likely to have ADHD and other learning disorders, and they're going to be more at risk for emotional and behavioral problems. And below, you'll see over here to the side, I've listed some of the examples of clinical diagnoses that a school psychologist might give you. Maybe a school phobia, just a fear of school and the evaluation at school, or just a more generalized anxiety disorder about being around people in general. Some kids with attachment problems are going to have difficulty leaving their parents in the day, and then the nature of their anxiety is going to be related to the separation from their caregiver, which may be more traumatic for them than for other children. Or you might have kids who maybe have the inability to develop attachments, who have trouble fitting in and coalescing with their school and students. And then you're going to get the kids that are really starting to act out, the oppositional kids and the kids that start to do sort of the bad things, the fighting and the stealing, the oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. The reason I give you these is I just want you to know that there are specific kinds of disorders that you will see in the DSM-5 that are diagnosed in school. So typically, it's during these early school years is when you're going to start to see psychological disorders begin to be diagnosed in children. Depression and anxiety. Why do you think that is, that the depression and anxiety begin to manifest? You know, we talk about this thing called the diathesis stress model, Araya. Not only is psychological illness the result of a genetic or developmental problem, but it's also a function of stress in the environment. So you may have the ego that can be depressed, but what it needs is a stressor, some sort of event to trigger that latent psychological problem. And school, for the first time, is when you move outside the protective embrace of a family and you move into the world of objective evaluation from other peers, and you are forced to be around people who you've never been around. So this is when impulse control, or the problems with impulse control, or self-image and inhibition and the problems associated with inhibition it's the first time they have an environment in which they're going to manifest. Does that make sense? Oh, why do you think this is, that guys are more affected than girls? That's a hard question, Araya. That's a really hard question. I mean, I could lob out a bunch of softball theories, but I don't think anybody knows. Is it biological due to the testosterone? Do we socialize boys with more antisocial social behaviors, aggressiveness that don't work in the classroom? Or do we focus on little girls social adjustment more? We care if little girls play nicely as much, not maybe more than little boys. So maybe it's this gender training that we do. Maybe it's testosterone. Maybe it's the fact that little boys don't mature quite as quickly. Their language and emotional skills don't mature quite as quickly because of biology, and maybe they're thrust into environments where they're overwhelmed. It's hard to say why little boys have these kinds of problems. I will tell you, though, that it turns out that there, I think, 106 males are conceived for every 100 females that are conceived. But it turns out little male embryos are less likely to make it to birth. So I think it's like 101 or 102 live male births for every 100 female births. And then what you will see throughout the lifetime is that males are more likely to die at every age group. So much that when you get to late adulthood, what you're going to find is that there are more females alive than there are males. That suggests to me that there is something about the male of this species that that's more problematic. It's the testosterone. I don't know. I just made up a bullcrap theory, Araya. You'll have to accept it for whatever you want to accept it for. I don't know. So, as I mentioned to you, treating the extremes of the distribution are not only a good idea, they are the law here in the United States. The IDEA law began in 1973. I think I forget what the name of that law was in 73. But in 1990, the Modern Ideal Act was passed, and it's the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. And basically what this act says is that that just like we have to make accommodations for a kid in a wheelchair to be able to get in the classroom and have a normal education, just like the kid who's blind needs some sort of accommodation so they can enjoy the classroom, we have to make the same sort of accommodations for children with psychological or intellectual difficulties. So that's basically what the IDEA Act is. It says that we have to educate kids. We can't just write them off because they have limited intellectual problems. Back in 1950, if you had dyslexia and you couldn't read, you just didn't pass through 6th grade and you had to drop out of school. If you had a math disorder and you couldn't you couldn't do transformations on math processes, you just didn't pass the 6th grade and you got kicked out of school. If you had an emotional problem, we didn't try to treat it, we just kicked you out of school. And what this law does is says that even though people have limitations that are psychological, we need to create school settings that help these children with these types of psychological difficulties, right? And so it sets out broad mandates for providing education to students with disabilities. Now, each student that has, with disabilities, I take that back, with disabilities or special gifts too, because it turns out if your child is gifted, they are also going to get an IEP, just as if they have a learning disability. An IEP is just a statement of plan. It's an intentional statement of plan that your school gives you that says how they plan to help your child based upon their unique situation. If it's that they're gifted, they're going to get some sort of extra nurturing educational environment separate and above what the other kids are getting. If your kid has dyslexia, they're going to get a special treatment to help them with their dyslexia. If they have attention deficit disorder, they're going to get special accommodations to help them with their ADHD. So basically, your IEP is just a plan that says how the school is going to meet your kids' unique choices. You probably don't get that in Poland. I think Edka probably would mention that. I don't know if she's still on here, but she would probably say they don't do that in Poland. And one of the things that they talk about is this idea of a least restrictive environment. They don't want to take your kid with a disability and put them in a special class away from all the other kids all day long and give them the stigma of somehow being different. So what the IEP does is it talks about how your child can be kept in the least restrictive environment. So if your kid has dyslexia, the only time they are differentiated and taken away from the other kids might be during reading time so that they can get the special help that they need. And then when it's time for math or history or something else, they're brought back in with the other kids. If your kid has a math disorder, you know what? They're just taken out during math class and given some special help during math class so that they can develop based on their level. And then they're brought back into the classroom for everything else. So the idea in the least restrictive environment is, yes, we want to help your kid, but at the same time, we don't want to stigmatize them by totally separating them out from the other kids. Now, I remember back in the 1970s, they weren't as focused on these least restrictive environments. I think they were doing it, but I do remember back in the day, there were classrooms and stigmas because there were certain children who were separated from us in second and third grade, and they were clearly different, and sort of we developed in school this us versus them mentality. And I think the reason they have the least restrictive environment is to give these kids the help while not attaching a stigma to them. They don't do that in Venezuela either, do they, Lorena? Interesting, very interesting point. If any of you have experiences in other places, you feel free to add them. Okay, okay, oh my gosh, wow. I just want you know what? IQ testing is the way in which they diagnose most psychological disorders. What you look for as a child in a learning disorder is a kid who has normal IQ, but for some reason doesn't do well in school. School is designed for all children to do well. So if your kid scores in the normal range on an IQ test, somewhere in this middle 68% range, and they still do poorly, we begin to suspect that your child has some sort of a learning disorder or other related disability that impairs their school functioning. So IQ tests are used to help diagnose learning disabilities as well as giftedness and as well as intellectual disabilities. So if you have trouble in school and they send you to your school psychologist, probably the first thing they're going to do is give you an IQ test. They were invented in 1904 and they're used to classify children for educational intervention. And keep in mind, IQ is related to but does not represent everything that intelligence means. Okay, there are two broad IQ two most famous IQ tests I want you to know about. The Stanford Binet, it was the first IQ test ever developed, and the Wechsler scales are the most popular in use right now. The Wechsler has 3 tests, one for 4 to 6 year olds, that's kids in early childhood, and then there's one for kids from 6 to 16, that's school-age children, and then there's an adult Wechsler test. I'll bet you didn't know this, but IQ can be reliably measured at the age, starting at the age of 4. Okay, so the Wechsler scales. So, and what I do not know these different categories, but what I want you to know is that when you take an IQ test, you get one overall IQ score, and then more importantly, they break down your functioning into different verbal and nonverbal categories, and it's the breaking down of these scores into different categories that begins to help us diagnose specific learning disorders. For example, on both the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler scales, they test your ability to pay attention. So some kids score normal on an IQ test, but they score really low on the attention part of the IQ test. We begin to suspect that these kids have a attention disorder. There are some kids who have difficulty on the numerical part of the IQ test, but they do better on everything else. So we begin to guess that maybe they have a math disorder. So do you see how these specific categories help us to begin to diagnose learning disorders? Okay. Now, there are two extremes of the population. Okay. Down here at the very bottom from 70 and below, and at the top from 130 and above. Those represent two very distinct parts of the IQ population. Down at the bottom end of the level, if you score below a 70 on an IQ test and you have difficulty in engaging in daily activities, you may get the diagnosis of intellectual disability. Now, what you're going to see is some kids have low IQs because they might have some sort of brain damage. They may be autism's going to sometimes be associated with organic disability, intellectual disability. Your kids with Down syndrome are going to demonstrate intellectual disability. And we would say that those kids have an organic cause for their intellectual disability. But some kids score in the 50 to 70 range, and there's no real reason why, no organic reason we can point to. If you remember, we talked a little bit about neglect and the need for stimulation for the brain. There are some people who think that kids fall into this mildly intellectually disabled region because they are brought up in non-stimulating environments. So we say they have what we call cultural familial disability or retardation. Okay? And then the other end of the spectrum are those kids that score in the top 2% of the IQ spectrum. And those kids are going to be the ones that get the gifted education, the AG education, starting in elementary school. And you're going to notice that these kids tend to be precocious. That is, they're way ahead of the other kids. They're usually pretty unique. They have their own unique desires. They don't fit in as much. They're kind of these kids that have their own things. They're already into their own thing. And you'll often find that these kids are pretty much self-driven. You don't have to motivate them. They motivate themselves. And let's see. So there are ethnic variations on IQ tests. Do not read too much into those. Unfortunately, we find that there are stereotypes that buy into these variations, and it turns out that when you give minority kids IQ tests but tell them that they're problem-solving tests, the differences between these two groups tend to go away. So we're not sure why there are differences in IQ tests, but we think that they are due to stereotypes that we all have in our culture. I'm sorry I finished this up. Don't worry about outside theories of intelligence. That is not going to be on the test. Theories of intelligence will not be on the test. I am running out of time. Oh my goodness. Thank you very much for staying 50 minutes. I am so sorry. I'm going to let you go now. If anybody has any questions, we'll talk more about this in webinar on Wednesday. Please watch the videos please watch the webinar videos about special schools for the webinar on Wednesday. I think you're going to find these school videos to be very, very interesting. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and let you go now. It was great to see everybody. Have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow, okay? Bye.